This is for Refuah Shlema for the Cholim, the Klal Yisrael.
Amen.
And the last part of people doing stuff for you on Shabbos, especially Gentiles, we're going to just do that, and we're going to go through a checklist, which will take a minute or two, which is very quick.
Sure.
So after Shabbos, if a Gentile carried out a malacha on Shabbos, specifically for a Jew, one may not benefit from it even after Shabbos has ended, until the period has lapsed of Bichdei Shea Aseh, the time that it would take to perform such a malacha after nightfall. This rule was enacted: A, to discourage any benefit from a malacha done for a Jew, and B, to discourage one from requesting work on Shabbos intended to be of benefit after the Shabbos has ended. Then Sforno says, remember the Sabbath day. One should organize his weekly affairs during the week in such a manner that he can forget about them on Shabbos. And the Balaturim says, also remember the Sabbath day, and he's taken it as this is the 7th verse of the 10 Commandments on the 2 tablets. The verse starts with a Zayin, the 7th letter of the alphabet, and it legislates for 7 categories: you, your son, your daughter, your servant, your maidservant, your cattle, and your stranger. The 5 Hebrew words of the sentence teach that one who observes Shabbos is regarded. So that, I think, is self-explanatory. You just go through a quick list here. It says Friday. This book's actually, we nearly finished this book. It says Friday checklist. It is a good idea to make a checklist to ensure that one is fully prepared before Shabbos commences and to reduce any likelihood of malacha taking place. Okay, so it says, have you cooked the required foods? Have you meisered the Israeli produce? Have you minced or grated vegetables? Have you cut salad cress from soil there? Have you grated or mashed baby's food, covered the stove with a black, prepared a hot water urn, prepared tea essence, checked pockets so as not to carry, checked fencing so as to ensure the Eruv is up, set a time switch for heating and lighting, checked the thermostat settings, deactivated the fridge light, opened food packets, milk, sugar, chocolates, torn plastic bags off the roll, prepared sheets of foil, plastic wrap, paper towels, and toilet paper, put away mixed articles, prepared a key belt for carrying in a non-Eruv area, set the alarm clock, polished the shoes, torn pieces of absorbent cotton, combed your hair, cut your nails, applied your makeup, and lit candles. And then just the one thing to finish off here. These are 3 things a man must say to his household on Sabbath, on Erev Shabbos. Have you meistered the food? Have you made the Eruv? And kindle the Shabbos light? And that comes from Mishnah Shabbos, chapter 2, paragraph 7.
All right, guys, we're going to quickly start off from this point. It's going to be a lot quicker. I'm sorry, I can't even keep a straight face. All right, so Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis disagree, because Rabbi Yehuda says we include utensils. The rabbis say we do not. What issue do they agree with? That by the term ox and donkey, that that other animals are included in the category of those that make the owner of the pit liable for restitution. Okay, that being the case, we want to know, well, exactly how do they work that out? So the first thing of it is, if you look at the sentence where it's basically stating the verb first, v'nafal, and it comes before the subject itself. So the subject is shor or hamor, the ox or the donkey. Now, if we just take a look at the verb itself, the verb is general, shall forward. We haven't excluded anything. We haven't included anything. General, okay? It's a general verb. The minute we say shall fall, being an ox or a donkey, as Kevin said quite rightly, that's specific to 2 animals. So we have a hermeneutic principle. What's a hermeneutic principle? Is if you look in your siddur, Kevin, I don't know if you've got an Art Scroll siddur with you.
Yeah. But it's a transliterator. Let me get one.
So hermeneutic principle, I think in total, we must check how many there are. There are 13 of them. So we're going to discuss the principle of what happens, and it comes from Kedushin 21b, that what happens when you take a general statement and then assign to it a specific application. You want to show your Siddur? Okay, do you want to show the hermeneutic principles that we learn in Shachrit? Is it on page 41? Where is it?
No, this is a transliteration. This is a new type of the article. If you say 41, where is it after Brachot? Where is it?
I don't know. It's in the Shachrit. Let me just see if I can find it on my side. Yeah, I found it. It's on page 49 on the Art Scroll Siddur. Okay?
No, there's different pages. The pages are different, yeah, because this is just a weekday one.
So if you ever look at your normal Art Scroll Siddur, it's on page 49, 51, and it ends on page 53. Okay. So the hermeneutic principles, basically one of them is as follows, and I just want to explain to you how it works. If you've got a generalization, Kev, don't worry about the Siddur now. If you've got a generalization, like in this case we had a verb for nafal, shall fall, it's not specific, and then you've got a specification. You've got what you call you've got a klalim and pratim. Klalim are generalities and pratim are specifics. So when you've got a klal, a generalization, and then you've got a prat, a specific, we then have to hone in on the specific. Why? Well, logic. Because what it is it's a funneling sort of system. So if I say, guys, I owe you money, and that's a general term, well, for what? And if I say, if my property damages yours, now I'm specifically saying in what context I owe you money. So the general principle of me owing you money is only in specific reference to liability for damaging your property. So it's a funnel system. You state the general clause and then you go specific. So then you stay to that narrow focus of the specific. So the hermeneutic principles, some of them are based on sephoras, meaning logic, and some of them are based on scriptural. Does that make sense? That can be deduced in terms of ways to learn Gemara. So what do we do in this case? So we say, all right, so we have this generalization about falling in, and then it's specific with regards to an ox or a donkey, and that we have liability. But we seem to deduce from there, so then how do we deduce if anything else falls in, he is not liable? In other words, on what basis do we hold the owner liable for damage to other species of animals? Because if you're just going by generalization, then a specification, you seem to have only included an ox or a donkey. What phrase can we learn now using the hermeneutic principles to actually include other animals? Because it seems as though, according to that principle, we cannot. So if any of you have done your learning, you will know how we did it. How did we do it, guys?
How did we deduce?
Yeah, no, I remember this.
I'm drinking the juice now. What are you saying? I'm sorry, Kev. I couldn't resist. Your humor is great.
I was going to say that. I didn't want to. I thought maybe you would.
Okay. So I'm saying, what do we do? How do we include other animals? Because it seems, does that make sense? According to the principle we learn in this particular pasuk, you've got a generality, then you've got a specific. So in other words, according to the hermeneutic principle, when you go from general to specific, you focus on the tunnel vision of the specific. How do we then come to include other animals? Gavin, Arthur, I've put Gavin on the spotlight. I want to know what Gavin says.
I had to have prepped today in order to remember. I don't remember. I just need to look at my book and I can work it out. But
okay, what do you suggest?
I just
I
can't
think.
remember.
Okay, Gavin, you want to try?
No, you go for it. I'm busy
I
thinking.
think it can include, if it's general, then it includes all animals. It has to be a generalization. Then maybe they're being specific for, maybe in most cases it was ox and the donkey that may have fallen into the pit. But the generalization includes all animals, I think.
Okay, so look, Kevin's brought up even though it's not the right answer, he brought up an interesting point. And we learned this in the beginning of the daf in 2b. Okay, what did we learn? We learned that when it mentions an animal like the ox in the Torah or certain animals, we refer to a specific sort of damage because that's the animal it mentions. But why is that animal mentioned in the Torah? Because it's the most commonly damaged. So Kevin's got a good point. Even though that's not the answer, I think it's a very relevant point. It's not that we just bring things from the Torah, because obviously the scriptural verse holds law above all else, even above logic. But those examples in the Torah are because they're the most common workhorse animals. So Kevin is right. That's a good point. But how does it include other animals? And the way it does is that you've got to finish reading.
1 second. I want to give it a shot.
Okay.
So this is what I read. Just to give you, I don't have it exact, but I've got an idea. So that from what I remember, even when I read this, I think I just read it a bit quickly. I should have taken a bit more time. But I remember something along the lines that it's general, then it goes specific, and then it goes back to general again.
Excellent.
The reason why it goes specific is because it's a donkey. There's different types of animals. I was trying to explain to you, I didn't quite get it. They're different types. So if they didn't put donkey in there, you wouldn't have realized they had to have they're two different types of animals, classes. They fit into different categories. So there's like two different product types. So they wanted to show you if they just put ox in there and they didn't put donkey in there, then you wouldn't have known about that. I can't remember the exact answer for that. That was the one thing. And then you go back. So they bring the two in to show you that those two categories, like Kevin's saying, the one is like a common thing and the other one is a bit different. And then they go back to generalization after it's incorporated everything.
Can I just add something?
Sure, of course.
Has it also got to deal with the fact that in terms of offerings, a donkey is not allowed to be offered in the Mizbeach, where ox can, but they can still both be a bechor. You still have to take the...
Excellent. So Kevin, your memory and your preparation was honestly fantastic. That's exactly what we're going to get to. So I can see you've prepared. I really, really appreciate it very much. And thank you. Thank you very, very much. Gavin is right in terms of principle, but the thing of it is, I want to see if I understood him correctly. So why does it go? Because I want to know exactly why it goes general, specific, general.
I can't remember all that.
In other words, just give a simple reason.
The simple reason is basically it goes general because it always starts with general. You got to kind of incorporate, that's the way Gemara works. You know, it starts with and then it narrows it down. You know, so it starts off at a high level and then it narrows it down to those two because those two have specific elements of each of them they're not the same type of animal type of thing. So those two categories had to be mentioned for a certain reason. I can't remember what it is. Okay. But it's basically what Kevin's saying. That's more or less the answer.
Yes, but then why does it go back to general? Because Kevin is correct. Is that okay? So now let me just finish on Kevin's point because Kevin's correct. So if it's now saying right now that we've got these two categories, they obviously have things in common and things that are different to each other. And we can extrapolate from there what's included in the list or excluded. Why would it have to go back to general? What for? I mean, in other words...
you'd be stuck just with only those two animals putting into a place. That would be ludicrous. So you have to expound it and make sure that it incorporates all animals that could possibly be put in there.
Well, not necessarily, because if you just leave the general and you go to the specific, then it could hone it into those two. the either or scenario. But if it goes to general to specific, then it could hone it in. In other words, that's fine. But when it expands it, how come it doesn't expand it now to include everything? In other words, how does the amplification process work? In other words, what the Gemara is going to bring up later is how far do you expand it? That's the concept I want you guys to get, is that the Gemara itself is going to struggle with that question. How far do you expand it? In other words, we've gone broad, then we've gone narrow, then we go a bit broader because of the generalization, specification, and then generalization. Okay?
But it stops at man because it's different context from people.
No, but that's not what I'm asking. I mean, you could expand it without including man. Man is a separate issue. Man is a separate issue because he's a sentient being. But I mean, you could talk about issues of Tuma and Tara and all living creatures, non-living creatures. You can talk about Bechor, Mizbeach issues. How far do you expand it and how specific do you narrow it? That's what the Gemara is going to address. How do you use these tools? And how do you know? It's almost like a lens on a sniper rifle. How do you know when to focus it in or to get a broader view? That's what we're going to deal with. Does that make sense?
So we'll wait to hear.
No, so we'll wait to hear. But I'm saying I just want you to get the broader context of what's being discussed in the Gemara, because it's not so clear in terms of how to use those tools. Does that make sense? So obviously the question arises, we ought to conclude that if an ox or a donkey falls into a pit, you're liable. But if anything else falls into the pit, you're not liable. Okay? So on what basis do we hold the owner liable for damage to other species of animals? And Kevin and Gavin quite rightly said that when the verse follows, so what it does is it starts off in general terms, right? It turns off and says shall fall. That's general. Then it says an ox or donkey or specific. If it stopped there, we might have a problem that it could only be an ox or a donkey or both. Okay, and that's what we were dealing with. Now, you've got to finish a pasuk in order to know how far to take the area of focus. So what happens is now we go back to a generalization. And how do we do it? Is because the words are as follows in the pasuk. Gav, can I finish? What were you going to say? I'm just in the middle of something.
No, go ahead. I'm rude. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, you're not rude. If you have something to say, I'm listening. Maybe you were trying to.
There was a three words in the, and they're using three words in order to connect it. I remember something like it.
Yeah, not here. Not at this point. Not at this point. Not at this point. Firstly, there were words before with the word or. Was it free? Was it not free? As far as this point is concerned, not. Because you can't go into Gezerah Shabbos when you're dealing with one hermeneutic principle. You can't halfway shift into another principle. You've got to finish where that principle is going and then see if there's another hermeneutic principle to apply to it. So you can't stop it halfway. So when we read it, we say general, specific, or specialization and generalization again. The klal, the general, the prat, the specific, and the klal again. So when you continue and you say the owner of the pit shall make restitution, it again generalizes. Okay? And where's that? That's in Shemot chapter 21, verse 34. So we've got general, specific, general. Now, the thing I want you to understand, and I'm going to share where it comes from in Kedushin, is how does it work? So this is the rule. If the Torah states a generalization, followed by a specification, followed by another generalization, you may expound the overall law to include only those things that are similar to the specification. So now you've got to be very, very, now you've got to really understand what you're doing, because it sounds as though there was no point to the generalization. If it's saying that specific, as Gemara is saying, in other words, it says, you may expound the overall law to include only those things that are similar to the specification, then it seems what was the point of the last generalization? Am I correct, guys?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's in the Gemara. So the thing of it is what you need to know is, like, upon occasion, the Torah will initially pronounce a law in general, right? In an expansive way, as Gavin said, talk in general terms, and then follow the general statement with the restrictive application of the law, okay? Starting to narrow the focus. And finally, it would put forth another general statement to close the clause. So the hermeneutic principle of klal or prat of a klal is generalization, specification, generalization. So that then teaches us how to expound the law. Now, the specific case defines the first general statement, and then it's limiting its application to the specific case only. But the final expansive statement serves to broaden the application of the law by a degree. What do we mean by a degree? Not to the general degree that it was before there was a specification, but to a certain degree to include all cases that are similar to the case described in the specific statement. And I'm going to share with you Kedushin 21b. So what I'm saying is, it doesn't then restrict it only to an ox or donkey, because now it's gone back to general. But it doesn't widen it to the degree of you necessarily dealing with all living creatures, because then you could have just said whatever fell in. In fact, if you said whatever fell in, you could consider non-living creatures. So this is the discussion of the Gemara. Do we say, for example, that an ox or donkey is living, so every living creature is included? Or is it some things that are more specific than that, but more general than just an ox or donkey? What do you mean? So let's see what ox and donkey have in common and apply that to other creatures or other categories within that. But how broad do we go? Do we go to the fact that they're both living creatures, so every living creature? And we're going to discuss separately why man isn't included. But for principle, do we go that broad again? In other words, the shall for was so general, it could have even included utensils, non-living things. And then the next specificity was ox or donkey. It could either be ox or donkey or both. Okay? But then when it went general again, do we say, well, both those creatures are living, so any living creature, and therefore we've now at least excluded utensils. But it's going to be interesting, because then you kind of say, Rav Yehuda will say then, we need to include it with the word or, and then what did it achieve? So do you then say, okay, well, it at least achieved the rabbi's point of view of saying it excludes utensils? Because you could know now an ox or a donkey. But then if it was either or, then what was the point of going back to the generalization, unless it included other things as well? So do we then say, well, what else does an ox or donkey have in common? Not that are unique, but that have in common. And then apply that in terms of certain creatures carry tumah and certain creatures do not. Like winged animals, winged birds don't carry tumah in the same way as animals do. So we then include in the list maybe other creatures that carry tumah, like the ox and the donkey if you touch them, but we don't include birds? Or do we say maybe that we include every living creature? And that depends on to what degree you expand the generalization again. But at least we've excluded utensils according to the rabbis. So that's a principle that we're trying to deal with at the moment. Guys, am I explaining it okay? Am I making some sort of a sense to you?
Perfect. For me. Kevin, you okay there?
Yeah.
So I'm going to share my screen and then explain to you where this comes from in Kedushin. Okay? Okay. So if we have a look, all right. We're in Kedushin 21b. So I want I want Kevin to read.
The Gemara explains. Rav Yehuda Hanassi expounds the verses by means of the hermeneutical principle of reading the verse as consisting of generalizations and details. Accordingly, he maintains that the term, "and you shall take," is a generalization that indicates piercing may be performed with an implement, and all is a detail. And when the verse states, "through his ear and into the door," Devarim chapter 15, verse 17, it then generalized again. When the verse writes a generalization and a detail and a generalization, you may deduce that the verse is referring only to items similar to the detail. Just as the explicit detail mentions an all, which is made of metal, so too any utensil used for piercing must be made of metal.
Okay, so before we go to the other opinion, what this teaches us is that if it stays to the specialization, or the specific, let's call it, then we can only use an all, okay, which is a specific type of metal item. It's like using the equivalent of a ice pick or whatever. It's very specific. But now when you broaden it again, you cannot use any item. It's still got to be similar. So it broadens it, but still within a certain degree of specificity. Does that make sense? But not as specific as that item alone. Now I'm going to read. I want you to read, Gavin, by contrast. Rabbi Yossi expounds.
By contrast, Rabbi Yossi expounds the verses by means of the humanotical. Is that right?
Yeah, so you read it as firstly the word without the nautical, hermen, like hermen, and then newt, as in you neuter an animal. Hermeneutical principle. It's a tongue twister. Don't worry about it, but you're doing good.
Okay, hermeneutical principle of reading the verse as consisting of amplifications and restrictions. Accordingly, he learns that the term and you shall take amplifies, i.e. includes an item that can be taken in one's hand. The term and all restricts. When the verse states, though through his ear and into the door, it then amplifies again. When the verse amplifies, restricts, and amplifies the halacha to include everything except one item.
Okay, so, we've got two contrasting opinions, but it seems that our Gemara might be going more according to Rav Yehuda Hanassi. Okay? Just in terms of not only including one other item. Does that make sense? So whether you call it generalization, specification, generalization, or expands and contracts, or expands and restricts, the concept is exactly the same. And in fact, I like the term expands and restricts. It's also a nice way of saying it, I think. Okay? So just to put it in context, so Rashi, as a commentary on Kiddush in 21b, and he gives an insight into the fundamental concept of this principle. So the restrictive clause is understood to be an explanation of the broader clause which precedes it. So in other words, the specific case defines the first general statement, confining its application to that case only. And then when it expands it again, it's only expanding it by a certain degree, but not to an absolute general term it had before the constriction. Does that make sense? So in other words, at least Rashi says that the Gemara has answered the question according to the rabbis, but it'll deal with Rabbi Yehuda later, because he said the word all comes to include even inanimate objects. But your question could be, well, if he learns like that, then what was the point of the general going to the specific back to the general? You could have just left it at general then if you're including utensils. You don't even need the word or. So it's a bit difficult to understand that, but he's obviously got his reasons, Rav Yehuda. We're just going to deal with it at a later stage. Does that make sense? So in other words, we don't know how broad to expand the generalization. So the derivation can teach, just as the specified items for in this case an ox or donkey, are specifically living creatures. So too for any living creatures that are damaged by falling into a pit, the owner is liable. Okay? So that alone would exclude utensils. So we'll get to how Rav Yehuda uses the human nautical principles with the word or. But for now, the Gemara is proposing that we actually expand it quite a lot and say that anything with a pulse that's living is included. So what does that include? Gavin, I don't think it would include plants for one reason. I think you're right. Is because today we see plants as phytoplankton and living organisms. But how things worked in medieval times is you had different levels of consciousness about how they defined an animal. So you had what you call inanimate objects, right? Like a rock or a stone and things that didn't have a consciousness. And then you had something with a degree of reactiveness, but it couldn't move. It was inanimate. So, for example, a plant can process carbohydrates through photosynthesis and do complex chemical permutations, but it's not able to communicate or animate, let's put it that way. And then you've got animals that are able to animate, but not necessarily communicate in audible speech. So you've got levels of consciousness, and that's how it would be defined, not necessarily as breath. So when the Gemara proposes this, it says maybe we are broadening it too much. Maybe we should just talk about a specified item, an ox or donkey, something, because both of them have one thing in common. They both have carcasses, as in normal animals, that convey tumah through contact and carrying. So too, the derivation teaches us to include anything else whose carcass conveys tumah through contact and carrying. Accordingly, only animals will be included in the law of compensation when damaged in the pit, but birds will not be included. Why? The carcass of a bird doesn't contaminate one who touches or carries it. Okay? And with regards to an animal, even if you have it in a container, it can contaminate even without touching it directly. And where's that? From Leviticus chapter 11, verse 39. Okay? I'm just going to share my screen a second. Yeah. If an animal you may eat has died, anyone who touches its carcass shall be unclean until evening. Anyone who eats of its carcass shall wash his clothes and remain unclean until evening. And anyone who carries its carcass shall wash his clothes and remain unclean until evening. So we don't know how broad to go. Are we just saying living creatures as in anything that moves, as in animate, or only animals that are capable of transmitting and carrying tumah? All right, guys, we'll hit it tomorrow. I think we've done enough.
All right. Thank you.